It has been more than 50 years since Southern pastors, parishioners, citizens, and young Americans played major roles in the most important movement of the 20th century. The movement for human and civil rights took place in the churches and streets of America.
The modern African-American freedom struggle was one of the great freedom struggles in world history. I would put it on a par with the anti-slavery struggle, and in terms of symbolic importance, even relate it back to the Exodus from Egypt. It has inspired so many other struggles.
If you don't tell your own story, you can't really expect anybody else to. We probably have been slow to that lesson.
The main thing is to get the young people, the generations that will come after me, to know about, they need to know their history.
What we call unsung heroes and heroines. We're gonna have to start making sure that people don't miss it. Because if we allow folk to miss history, then people can come up and make up what they want to make up.
A prophet is never really recognized in their own time among their own people.
They was born to free people.
Not everybody in their own time said, oh, this person is a prophet that we have to follow.
And I said that all that is by Jesus, the Jesus movement. He still lives. He lived in Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. and AD put that in us. And so he's still living in us and living in others. It all depends on how you go out and define that living.
We're prepared to die if necessary. And Martin King, I think, once said there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And when you move to the point where you're prepared to die, your enemy doesn't quite know how to handle you. Because once you give up your life, there's nothing else. What can he do besides shoot you?
King was a mighty warrior. He claimed his death by water. One was enough, two they couldn't stand. That's why they got rid of God's preacher man.
Reverend Alfred Daniel Williams King was the younger brother of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Like his iconic brother, he was a Baptist preacher and an active civil rights leader. Arguably the greatest leader of the 20th century, Dr. Martin Luther King was fortunate to have his younger brother, A.D., constantly at his side.
His contributions were many. He really was a civil rights giant, active in all of the movements.
Seeing A.D. as one of the leaders in the movement by being the brother of Martin Luther King Jr., but really being his own, because he was able to get there and give leadership. A whole lot of times that Dr. King wasn't there.
As the baby brother, he didn't get the attention that his elder brother got. He was one of about 4 preachers that, along with Fred Shuttlesworth, invited us to come into Birmingham. He went to jail in Birmingham with his brother. Out of 400 churches, there were only about 14 churches that would let us meet.
To some degree, his misfortune was to be the brother of Martin Luther King. That makes it very hard for him to make a mark on his own. If he had just been A.D. Smith, then we might appreciate his role more, because he was among that minority of black ministers in the South who did make the decision to become active in the movement.
Martin was such a giant of a man that he eclipsed everyone around him. He was such a significant figure that all the attention came to him.
My father had a personality as to where if he was in his own setting, then he would be the main attraction.
His brother always made the great speeches and was always the one who was on the platform. But A.D. was always there, as was his wife, Naomi.
I think that by Martin being the one, at that time, and history puts him like number one, then everybody else, whatever the civil rights giants, the other participants, just was just like secondary, and Martin just took precedent over everybody and everything.
A lot of people don't realize that my uncle relied on him heavily, and he provided that support, which was so important.
My father had his earned celebrity too, not with any boast intended.
He was secure enough to be around, but to still give his input and his support and not feel, threatened. And so he supported my uncle to be who he was.
I got the feeling that he preferred that background. And I have to confess that I didn't know A.D. King existed until after I got to know Dr. King and began spending time.
There's just a limited amount of things that we can see that come from A.D. King's hand. What is more likely is, for example, in the Birmingham campaign, when he's actively involved and he's at meetings, and we have recordings of the meetings, and of course interviews with other people who were involved in the Birmingham campaign. And then his role becomes more apparent.
Well, I have a younger brother too, and very few people know about him, but he's also very active in everything I do. In fact, most of what I do, I couldn't do without his support.
I don't think that his objective was to get out so that a lot of people would know him. His work would speak for him.
What happened to A.D. is not unique. Whenever you have a brother or a child who is outshining other children in the family, it's just one of those normal kind of things. It just happens that way.
My sense is that A.D., preferred Martin to be out there and not taking the heat, but being, and he didn't like that role, that he liked to be a strong support, maybe you would call it a foot soldier that was always there when he was needed, but not the guy leading the charge as his brother was doing.
Martin had the lamplight, but A.D. was a pastor, and a pastor with a message. And the civil rights in Atlanta, it belongs to the whole family.
I'm glad to see these young folk taking up the banner and going on and making sure that A.D.'s legacy is not forgotten.
Reverend A.D. King's family, Mrs. Naomi King, and some of the other members of the King family and friends of the King family, I'm a part of that, are all working to help put together a part of that story. We can never tell it all. One generation does not live long enough, but there is an effort to put together the A.D. King story, and that's wonderful.
Had it not been for A.D. and Fred Bennett, all of those preachers from across the world wouldn't have never got together to integrate a lot of these businesses. That's why we see all these black managers. These companies didn't just get kind and good. It was folk like A.D. and Bennett and those other preachers who brought that together, and that's the best thing that folk need to know, I think, about A.D.
My heart bleeds because my illustrious husband is not here, and all of that, the causes that he gave his life for, and not to be able to have any acclaim to all of the hard work that he has done and put forth, and to be back at this point now without him, I feel a terrible injustice that he is not here to get his dues.
Like his brother, Reverend A.D. practiced and was a staunch believer in nonviolent direct action. Unlike his brother, Reverend A.D. remained mostly outside of the media spotlight. Not being in the media spotlight never seemed to bother A.D. Because he stayed in the background, most people really never knew how deeply involved he was in the civil rights movement.
I know for a fact A.D.'s involvement was very, very heavy there in Birmingham with Fred Shuttlesworth and with SCLC, because he lived there. In Louisville, Kentucky, that was A.D.'s movement.
I wish people had known about his boldness and the fact that he was able to mobilize, because he was a great pioneer in Kentucky with the Kentucky SCLC chapter.
That was A.D.'s leadership. He made his church available. The young people in the community respected him and loved him. And he was one of those who prepared the way for his brother.
A.D. King had as much commitment, if maybe even more commitment, than his brother Martin.
Those of us in the movement related to A.D. On a level of brother to brother, because a lot of us would watch him preach, and he was one of the preaching rascals that God put down here. We would try to pick up terms from him in his ministry.
He was on the first sit-in. He was there on the committee. He participated, worked hard, picketed, you name it.
I had a number of interactions with A.D. King. We met any number of times at meetings. We talked about things. He was certainly a player that I came upon quite regularly.
There was two people who were very, very close to Dr. King. And A.D. was one of them, and the other one was Fred C. Bennett. Reverend Bennett was closer to A.D., and Bennett probably had the best mind of clergy, of the pulling together of the breadbasket program that we had today, and that was a brainchild of Fred C. Bennett, who collaborated with A.D.
Economics. You didn't have any money. Couldn't save no money. And then the banks wouldn't lend you no money because you didn't have no credibility.
And it was their collaboration and strategy talk that opened up the integration of bread companies, that opened up the integration of milk companies, so that African Americans could basically be not just the drinkers of the milk, but sellers of the milk, not just eat the bread, but sell the bread. It was those guys who was able to collaborate on the ground to make sure that Dr. King had something to talk about when he went to the whole idea of dealing with the strategy of the Operation Breadbasket program.
Whatever the situation was, and always whenever Martin, his brother, was active in and needed his presence and his participation, he was there. So his participation was awesome.
He did an excellent job, one in Atlanta, in Birmingham, in Louisville, Kentucky, and when he moved back to Atlanta, he was fully engaged in carrying on the work and the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
I knew that he was trying to help people and trying to help black folks.
He's a great man. Yeah. Feared nothing. Yeah, he was a tough fella.
The Lord guided everything, I think, that took place during that period. I'm here because he was watching over me in the Perry County Jail. Jimmy Lee gave his life for me to live.
Honestly, we were never afraid during the whole movement, and the reason we weren't afraid, if you know that song, We Shall Overcome, one of the verses, we are not afraid, and certainly God is on our side. So we were coached and trained by our family, by our parents. We grew up in the church setting. The people in our family not only kept Bibles, but they read the Bible and they taught it, so we were not afraid.
We are not afraid. We are brave. We are not afraid.
At that time, I was kind of young. I wasn't afraid of nothing too much right then. So, and he had told us not to talk. Said whatever they call you, just keep marching. And he would call us N-word, all those kind of things. And we just kept walking and carrying our signs. And we did integrate.
He was a good leader. He was a good preacher, he was a good pastor. But he stayed on the road quite a bit, making speeches. I would say he was a very, very good person.
During our times, we boycotted a lot. And at Easter, we had a Black Easter. And at Black Easter, you didn't get new clothes. And if you had an Easter egg hunt, it was just with things that are around, because you did not go to the store and nothing was purchased. During our Black Christmas, you boycotted, and you did not purchase gifts or toys from stores unless they were black Negro stores, we would call back then, or colored. So if you couldn't buy from a colored vendor, you bought no gifts, no presents. There were seasons when if you could not buy your food from a colored vendor, then you bought no food. And so we had to be very creative during those periods.
One of Dr. King's last messages was, what does it profit if we have opened the doors to all of these places and we can't afford to go in and exercise the rights that we have fought for? And so the Poor People's Campaign was really an attempt to integrate the money.
People are just beginning to recognize the magnitude and contributions Reverend A.D. Williams King brought to the civil rights movement. He was active in numerous successful campaigns, including Atlanta, Birmingham, and Louisville.
There are a lot of amazing stories from the student sit-in movement that, have not been told. And as you know, the story of A.D. King generally has not been told.
A whole generation of white people in America, and some black people, were intimately involved in the Jim Crow system, and the segregation system, and keeping it going, sustaining it.
There's a lot of people glamorize that period, because we're past it now. But the fact of the matter is that people lost their lives. Many people dropped out of school who, were in the movement and who were not able to keep up with their studies. And some of them came back later. June Bond, I think, was one who dropped out and came back later. Some people never came back. It was a great period in the sense that we were able to, quote, fight back without fighting. We were able to make progress in race relations. And I think to a great extent played a major role in helping to bring about the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Many students were arrested, spent, in some cases, days, weeks in jail. Some students had particularly difficult incarceration experiences.
I went to jail with A.D. King, and that was one of my more memorable experiences. We sat in at a restaurant downtown, and there were 5 of us, and A.D. was the leader among us. For those of you who don't know, A.D. King was Dr. King's younger brother. And we were sitting at this lunch counter, and of course they asked us to leave. They made it clear they were not going to serve us. But then there was a young man who came in, heavyset white guy who had a spray gun. And he started spraying us as if we were flies. He was just spraying, just spraying. So they called the police, of course, on us. And when the police came, they had to arrest this individual who was spraying too. It turned out his name was John Sprayberry.
A.D. King was actually the leader of the group. I don't think A.D. was a student then, but the student movement here in Atlanta was well integrated with SCLC, probably more so than anywhere else in the country. We went to Dr. King's church to hear him preach, and we were trained by some of the members in terms of nonviolent strategies and how to protect yourself when people are hitting you and spitting and stuff like that. But A.D. was the leader of the group.
Reverend King, they didn't advocate violence, Everything he did was nonviolent.
I guess what I remember about him, those 2 things stand out. Number one, that even though I was hard-headed and didn't listen to his advice, he was the first one to come to my rescue, when we were arrested. And then the fact that he reminded us that nonviolence was about forgiveness, that it was about not just not hitting. It's one thing to say, I'm going to take this and not hit back. But he said it's also not about hating. So even though the guy was spraying us, his point was this is an opportunity for forgiveness and action.
Martin Luther King Jr. believed in nonviolence. He did love his neighbor as himself. Because he was mortal, this belief was not a gift. It was a philosophy which grew from study, self-discipline, and prayer. As he achieved this way of life, so can I, and so can we all.
The guy who was spraying us, that was the guy who had been spraying us as if we were flies. As we were leaving the jail, A.D. suggested that we ask the officials to release him also, and they agreed. And so it was amazing when he came out and we were still there. He embraced each one of us. He apologized. He promised us that he would never ever do anything like that again, and in fact, he wanted to be a part of the civil rights movement.
When we were organized all over the South, they were putting us in jail all over the South, I called Martin King and went down to see him. I got an appointment with Mrs. Ballou, who was his secretary, who came over from Montgomery with him. And I went down to see him and suggested to him that what we ought to do is try to see, can we pull together a Southwide organization of young people, because we were going up against an organized opposition. And I mentioned to him that the anti-trespass laws were passed in Virginia first, And then like wildfire, they passed in Maryland and on down to North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all the way over to Texas.
There's another way in which courage and commitment are important, and that's in terms of the relationship of the Atlanta student movement to other individuals in the black community, specifically more established activists. Some of these activists, like the dean of Atlanta Black Preachers, Williams Holmes Borders, right, pastor of Wheat Street Baptist Church, took a great deal of pride in the work that these students were doing. Other activists, such as attorney and longtime NAACP activist A.T. Walden, may not have always took pride, but he was forced to stand up, pay attention, and take notice.
There are very few instances, if any, in history when an unorganized band was able to defeat an organized band. You've got to organize, and we need to have some kind of a coordinating situation. He agreed with me, and he asked Ella Baker, who was his interim executive director, to call a meeting, and she called it for, over his signature and his telegram. The meeting was called in Fort Riley over the Easter weekend in 1960. So King was the one who literally pulled SNCC together, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He doesn't get any credit for that, but he did.
One possible legacy is the absolute sophistication with which these students organized. They were arguably the most organized group. If you study the work of scholars, if you listen to these participants, then they will tell you that the organizational structure of the movement was done with almost military precision.
That group then organized, as you well know, and began to fan out all over the South. But we had to have shock troops who were willing to work beyond Georgia and beyond South Carolina. Because if you just look at these states in isolation, they can keep you divided. So we needed to have a way of passing on along information.
If you look at the power of the student movement throughout the South during the early 1960s, I would argue that the work of students here and elsewhere almost single-handedly forced the NAACP on a national level to change its position with respect to nonviolent direct action.
If you go back and look at that period of time, the newspapers stopped writing about the walls of segregation that were falling down. And you understand the logic? If you write about it, that means that's going to inspire somebody else. So let's put a blackout on this. And so they stopped writing about it. Well, it didn't matter, because if you have an organization going, you can communicate through the organization.
We were very organized. These students from 6 institutions were working together for a common cause. And the crux of the strength of our organization is that a core of students actually became full-time activists.
Let me tell you the tactic that the people used. They would close at lunchtime, time we would show up. And in time we would leave, they'd reopen. So what we said, wait a minute, why don't we get us a remote control device? So we actually got Ron Yancey, who was the first person to finish Georgia Tech in engineering, to design a radio system. And so we had walkie-talkies and what have you, and we would call, they closed down the lunch counter at Woolworths. So we left there to go to Cresty, or we left there to go to some other place. And then time to open up the lunch counter back at Woolworths, we knew to go back over there.
The feeling I had and others had when we moved together for a common cause that changed a segregated society is a feeling that's beyond any words I could use to explain, really.
Because when you're in a battle, you have to have some victories to keep the morale up. And as the border south began to fall, the barriers, those of us in the deep south took encouragement from that, knowing that if we just push a little harder, we can make it come on down. So you had it in Maryland, and then you had it in a small part of Virginia and Delaware, then in North Carolina, you know, coming on down to finally it got to Georgia.
I think what you can do if you come together, if you work together for a common goal. We really felt collectively we could move mountains.